Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is the third Sunday of Easter, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's Parish, where I talk about some things in the Bible that you may not have heard about in church, either because it's not quite appropriate for all audiences, or it just isn't something easy to talk about in a sermon. Today's readings for the third Sunday of Easter are Acts 9, 1 through 20, Psalm 30, Revelation 5, 11 through 14, and John 21, 1 through 19. Today we're going to talk about forgiveness and restoration, as we see in the lives of Peter and Saul, who eventually starts going by Paul. First, we'll talk about Peter. After boldly proclaiming that he would stand by Jesus even unto death, after Jesus is arrested, Peter denied him 3 times. In Luke's gospel, Jesus even watches Peter deny him. And then after the resurrection, Peter gets singled out among the disciples. The command for the women is to go tell the disciples, even Peter, that Jesus has risen. Peter seemed to be a bit excluded from the group. And then there's Saul. This is a guy who, well, he didn't deny Jesus to save his own skin like Peter. Saul actively persecuted the church. He arrested people, even killed people over their following Jesus. Then the incident in Acts 9 happens as he's on his way to Damascus with permission to arrest anyone he found who was a follower of Jesus. Of course, in the story, you know that Peter gets restored and Saul is converted and ends up going by Paul and writes a good chunk of the Christian scriptures. But I find it fascinating that in both cases, their restoration isn't immediate. Their forgiveness may be, but they're not fully part of the community until their repentance, a change in their heart and life, is obvious. For Peter, Jesus asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter seems to know what Jesus is up to. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, so he must assert his love 3 times. Also, in a rather cute thing that the author of the gospel does, Peter gets called Simon when he's being questioned, his given name, and then gets called Peter again, the name that Jesus gave him, after he's been restored. Don't know if that's a thing, but it's what happened. Saul went through a bit more of a restoration as his offense was a bit more serious. After he became a follower of Jesus, it took a lot of effort on his part and a good part of convincing from other disciples on his behalf for him to join the community. They knew who Saul was and what Saul had done. And so Saul needed to prove that something had changed, that something was different, before he was accepted by the other followers of Jesus. Were Peter and Paul forgiven by God? I believe so, absolutely. But they also weren't immediately received into the community. Especially with Paul, there needed to be receipts. Paul had caused great harm to the Christian community, and he needed to live his repentance of that harm in order to join that same community. All too often in churches today, we forget that repentance is an important part of restoration. We preach forgiveness and reconciliation for the perpetrators of violence, but we neglect the obvious change in behavior that goes with it. Too many loud Christian churches forgave the perpetrators of harm, only for them, without repentance, to turn around and harm more people later. I think it's especially bad because we have these great examples of how it's supposed to work in Peter and Paul. God forgave them, presumably right away, but to be restored to the community, to be reconciled with the others, they had to demonstrate repentance. They had to demonstrate that things were different before they got welcomed fully in. Especially for Paul, who caused so much harm. It took a lot of effort on his part, as well as the testimony of others, for the community of early Christians to welcome him among their number. When it comes to the restoration of those who have done wrong, especially when that wrong causes a lot of harm, it's important to remember this. And if someone has caused you harm, there's nothing wrong with choosing to avoid that person until they have proved that they have changed. In fact, that may well be the best choice for you and for your safety. And we see this lived out in the way that Jesus interacted with Peter after his denial, and the way the churches of Damascus and Jerusalem interacted with Paul after their conversion. So if you want to see more content like this, check out the links to my right, or click the logo just below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.